Have you ever stopped at a cheap motel on the road, weary from your travels, and wondered what's really hidden within the walls? It may be hard to believe, but I'll tell you the story of a night that will make you think twice about staying in any motel, especially those forgotten ones on the side of the road. I was on Route 66 in Texas, and like so many drivers who pass through this stretch of land, I just wanted to rest a bit before continuing my journey. What I didn't know was that upon entering that motel, I was about to discover something that would change my life forever. That motel seemed like so many others I'd stayed in, old, with peeling paint and a flashing neon light, almost as if warning me not to enter. I tried to ignore it. I was too tired to look for something better. But at that moment, everything seemed normal. Nothing that made me think this would be the worst nightmare of my life. I just wanted to sleep, unaware that the place I was staying in held something much darker than I could have imagined. Have you ever felt that sense of unease in a place that seemed too simple, but somehow wouldn't leave you alone? I was there, unsure of what awaited me, completely unaware that the motel was built on something many wanted to keep hidden. It wasn't until the next morning, when I began to feel a strange sensation, that I realized something was very wrong about the place. I'm not the type to scare easily, but that night caught me off guard. The walls of that motel were filled with stories, and with each passing second, the feeling of being watched only grew. I thought it was just fatigue, fear of the unknown, but what I discovered later was far more sinister than anything I had imagined. Have you ever felt like you were being watched, like something was waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? I think we've all been there, and believe me, I wasn't prepared for what I was about to discover. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you, and perhaps make you think twice before stopping at a random motel on the road. What seemed like just another ordinary stop on Route 66 soon turned into a chilling revelation. I didn't know it, but that simple stop was leading me to a forgotten history, buried beneath the feet of everyone who stayed at that motel. Something ancient, something that should have been kept in the past, but now was pulling me in. What seemed like a simple cheap motel soon revealed its secrets, and with every step I took, I felt more trapped in this nightmare. I was about to discover that what lay beneath my room's floor was something far more macabre than I could have imagined, and the moment the truth came out, everything I knew about that motel and its walls crumbled. Now, imagine what happens when the place you're trying to rest holds the darkest and most disturbing secrets. It will leave you as surprised as it did me. Are you ready to discover what really happens when the walls of an old motel begin to reveal their secrets? Stay with me, and you'll find out soon. I was trying to process everything I'd discovered, but the truth was, nothing seemed to make sense anymore. How could a simple cheap motel hide so many secrets? How could anyone rest easy knowing that the place it was built was directly linked to something so dark? The motel, with its musty smell and decrepit walls, seemed to be breathing, almost alive, watching me at every step. There was no denying that something was wrong there. What I saw and felt wasn't just the product of a tired mind. No, I knew something bigger, something far more sinister was unfolding right before my eyes. But I want to know, have you ever had an experience in a place like this? Have you ever experienced something that left you with the feeling that the place you were in was hiding more than it seemed? If this topic resonates with you, tell me in the comments what touched you most. Have you ever had a supernatural or uncomfortable experience while in a motel or other isolated location? Maybe your story can help someone prepare for or even avoid a similar situation. And if you enjoyed this story, this kind of content that blends mystery and true stories, don't forget to give it a like. Every like helps spread this content to more people. And honestly, every comment and every like means your support, so I can continue bringing more stories like this. Now, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do so. I know you don't want to miss any more terrifying stories like this, and I promise there are many more to come. Your participation here, with comments and interactions, is what makes this channel grow, and it's how we'll continue together, exploring these mysteries and supernatural experiences. And remember, the journey isn't over yet. What comes next will leave you even more intrigued. As I entered the motel hallway, the muffled sound of the neon lights and the whir of the fan shattering them, silence gave me the feeling that this place was unusual. It was the kind of motel you don't choose, but it's the only one you find along the way. And at that moment, exhaustion weighed more heavily than any other warning I could have heard. I felt as if the road itself had led me there, and somehow, Fate seemed to whisper that there was no turning back. Perhaps I was mistaken in thinking it was just another unimportant stop. Every step I took inside that motel felt like another dive into something I couldn't understand until then. The reception area was empty, and the only person I saw was a silent, expressionless figure, as if accustomed to the weary travelers who passed through. She handed me the key without a word, which somehow made me even more uneasy. The key, already old and worn, seemed to carry an inexplicable weight. I took it and walked down the hallway, noticing that the walls were dirty and the air was thick, as if the place were retaining all the energy of those who had passed through. The hallway light flickered intermittently, and the sound of my footsteps echoed like a warning I couldn't quite interpret. I entered the room, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. The smell of stale cigarettes mixed with mildew was unbearable. The room was stuffy, and the window, which should have provided a bit of nighttime freshness, was jammed shut. It wasn't the kind of place where you feel safe or comfortable, but I was so tired that I didn't care. I threw my backpack on the bed and sat up, staring at the room. The walls were peeling, and the lighting was so dim I could barely see any details. I knew that as night fell, the place would become even darker. It wasn't the best option, but it was what I had at the moment. And frankly, I just wanted to sleep. But little did I know that that night, in the small roadside motel, would lead me to a discovery I never imagined. Something hidden, not in the walls or ceiling, but right under my feet. Something so old and forgotten that until that moment, no one had dared reveal it. I was no longer in a simple cheap motel. The place somehow was like a portal to a buried history, full of secrets and mysteries no one dared touch. The feeling of being watched, which until then had seemed merely paranoia, intensified as the hours began to pass. I was trying to relax, but I couldn't stop staring at the floor. A barely perceptible crack caught my attention. Something about it made me uneasy. That simple flaw in the wood floor felt like an invitation, a gateway to something I shouldn't explore, but which, at the same time, I couldn't ignore. Every time my mind tried to wander, it returned to that small detail, as if something were pulling me, telling me to investigate, to understand what was behind it. It was then that I finally decided to take a closer look. It was an impulse, almost as if an invisible force had pushed me to do so. I pulled back the carpet, and a feeling of dread began to settle in my chest. What I found beneath the floor was not what I expected. It wasn't just the remains of an old building. There was something there, something much deeper. The crack revealed an opening, a staircase that descended into the shadows, a staircase that seemed endless. I hesitated. Something inside me screamed at me to turn back, to get out of there. But, as if in a kind of trance, I knew I had to go down. It was inevitable. And at that moment, as I descended the stairs, what I found at the bottom stopped me in my tracks. The silence, previously muffled, became deafening, as if the earth itself were awaiting my arrival. I didn't know what exactly lay beneath that motel, but I knew I was standing before something far more ancient than I could comprehend, something that should never have been discovered, but now, for some reason, belonged to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what you need to understand about that motel, about what was buried there, will completely change your perspective. I know you're curious, just as I was that night, and the revelations I'm about to share with you will leave you speechless. So, stay with me and prepare yourself, because what comes next will shake you in ways you never imagined. And if you're already beginning to grasp the gravity of this, tell me in the comments, what do you think so far? Have you ever felt somewhere that you were facing something much bigger than it seemed at first glance? I'm not the kind of person who seeks adventure or mystery. I'm the kind of guy who just wants some peace and quiet. After tiring days on the road, all I needed was a good night's sleep to recharge my batteries and continue on my journey. Deep down, I was so exhausted that I barely thought about anything other than sleep. That motel seemed like a normal stopover, one of those you find after hours of driving down the highway with few options. I wasn't looking for trouble or life-changing revelations. I just wanted to rest. I'd seen the place from the outside. I knew it was one of the many cheap motels that line Route 66. For someone like me, who travels frequently, it seemed like just another one of those stopping points that end up being forgotten more often than remembered. It's not the kind of place where you expect anything to happen. On the contrary, what you expect is exactly what it is: a simple bed, a quick shower, and the promise of a good night's sleep until the next day. But as soon as I walked in, I knew something was different. Not that it was anything overtly obvious or blatant. But the atmosphere, the silence, the smell of the air, everything felt charged somehow. The stuffy air seemed to hold the secrets of that place, as if it had witnessed something no one dared tell. The first thing I noticed was the sound of the neon lights flashing, one of those annoying things you only notice when you're alone and tired. It wasn't a five-star hotel, but who cared? I just needed a place to relax. I dragged myself to my room, and when I opened the door, the smell of cigarettes and mildew overwhelmed me. The light from the lamp hanging in the entryway barely illuminated the room, but like any weary traveler, I ignored the imperfections. I was too exhausted to notice. Tossing my backpack in the corner and closing the door behind me, I prepared to let the exhaustion overtake me. I sat up in bed, looked around, and felt a strange sensation. There was nothing special about the room. The walls were stained, the carpet was worn, and the bed had that "it's seen better days" feel. But even so, the feeling of discomfort was palpable. I was about to lie down when I looked at the floor and saw a small crack in the wood flooring. This wasn't normal. Those cracks weren't just the natural wear and tear of time. They felt different. They looked new, as if someone had forced the floor to give way somehow. But, like any normal person, I tried to push away the feeling of discomfort. It's nothing, I thought to myself, just a normal defect in an old place. But something told me to take a closer look. I lay in bed, trying to focus on other things, but my body was tense. Sleep wouldn't come, and the feeling of being watched only grew. The sound of the neon lights was still there, like an invisible presence. And the strangest thing, I wasn't alone. I knew I wasn't. The sense of a presence in the room was as strong as the air itself, and all I wanted was to simply sleep and wake up the next day, without any more surprises. But when the clock struck midnight, the uneasiness turned into an urgent need to understand what was happening there. Something wasn't right. The discomfort wasn't just physical, it was psychological. So I got out of bed and went to the mirror, trying to clear my mind. But as I looked in it, I saw something that shouldn't be there. A shadow, perhaps. It wasn't a clear reflection of myself, but something different. At first, I thought it was the low light, but as I looked closer, the shadow seemed to be watching me back. No, it wasn't my imagination. I didn't know what it was, but I began to feel a weight on my shoulders. What had seemed like a simple stop, a quiet night to rest, was now becoming a real race against time. Something was telling me to leave, but an invisible force seemed to keep me there, in that dimly lit room, in that Texas night that seemed never-ending. With each passing minute, I felt the motel swallow me more and more. Something inside me told me to run, to leave before it was too late. But as always, my curiosity overcame my fear. I needed to understand what was happening there, what the motel had hidden from me. And in that moment, I knew I was about to discover something that would change my worldview forever. What you need to understand about this motel, about what I discovered there, is something much bigger than mere coincidence or superstition. It wasn't just an architectural flaw. It wasn't just the wear and tear of an old place. What was happening there was much deeper, much older, and more powerful than anything I could have imagined. What I was about to discover was about to transform me in ways I could never have predicted. That strange feeling began to grow as the minutes passed, like a pressure I could no longer ignore. It was a silent but present discomfort. The motel, run down as it was, seemed like a normal place at first glance, but something about that space didn't fit. I knew my mind was starting to play tricks on me, but the truth was, the surroundings were making me increasingly uneasy. The musty smell mixed with burnt tobacco, the muffled sound of the air conditioning fan, the flickering light of the flickering lamp. Everything felt like a scene frozen in time, an echo of the past that had never quite managed to separate itself from this place. The room was simple, nothing more than the bare necessities, but what made me feel claustrophobic was the lack of life in the space. It was as if the motel were waiting for something, or someone. Every corner was immersed in an uneasy stillness, as if time itself had been lost there, trapped in this cycle of isolation. I threw myself onto the bed, trying to shake off the feeling and rest. But the more I tried to relax, the more it consumed me. That's when the noise started. It wasn't loud or thunderous, but enough to make me stop what I was doing and pay attention. It was coming from downstairs. It was a muffled sound, as if someone was walking slowly, heavy footsteps but unhurried, as if time were something that didn't matter in that place, as if that motel, with its walls full of stories and secrets, was preparing to tell one of them. At first, I tried to ignore it. It must be the old building, I thought. It must be the wind or something else making that sound. But I knew better. The sound seemed more real, more palpable. It was as if someone were deliberately moving beneath me, following some path I couldn't quite grasp, as if it were an invisible presence, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Fear began to creep in, but I tried to push away the idea that something else was going on. I was just too tired. It was just the tension of the road, I told myself. But as time passed, the sensation intensified. I was no longer hearing the sound. I was feeling its presence, as if the place were becoming increasingly cramped, the air thicker, as if something were being pulled into my space. Fear began to take shape, and for the first time, I wasn't sure what was there with me. So I decided to investigate. Part of me just wanted to convince myself it was all an illusion, but another part wanted to understand what was happening. What was I hearing? What was happening downstairs? I went to the door and looked through the peephole. I saw nothing, just the empty hallway. I decided to leave the room and go downstairs, but as I walked through the dark, dimly lit hallways, a premonition took over. Something told me to stop, but I couldn't. The feeling that something was wrong, that I shouldn't be there, grew stronger and stronger. When I reached the stairs leading to the lower floor, my body stopped of its own accord. I knew something was waiting for me. Something, or someone, was down there. The question that began to swirl in my head was, should I keep going, or would it be better to run away and never look back? Now, I wanted to delve even deeper into this matter. The truth is, I was just beginning to uncover what was hidden in that motel, and with each step I took, the revelations became more intense. What had seemed like a simple transit point was turning into a silent prison, and no matter how hard I tried to understand, there was no denying that I was already involved in something much bigger than I imagined. What else was hidden in the foundations of that place? What else could be revealed that night? The feeling that the motel was not just a physical space but also a kind of guardian of something much more sinister only grew. And that's what makes the journey so captivating, right? How much we let ourselves be carried away by a simple hunch, a sensation we can't explain, but which is capable of taking us to places and realities we never imagined. Stay with me, because what's coming will take your breath away. You'll realize that not every cheap motel is just a place to rest, and what I was about to discover, that night would be the key to unraveling an ancient mystery, hidden for decades. And you'll understand exactly what I mean when the time comes to confront the hidden truth that lay beneath me, waiting to be revealed. Comment below. This makes sense to me if you've ever experienced a similar feeling, or if you believe that sometimes life takes us to places we never imagined, but that, in some way, are part of our journey. The silence of the night dragged on, heavy and dense, as if the motel itself had stopped breathing. I lay there trying to find some rest, but what I felt in the air was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. There was something there with me, something unseen, but manifested in a growing sense of unease. It wasn't a physical sensation, but a pressure in my chest, an unsettling feeling that someone or something was watching me. The sound, at first faint, almost imperceptible, began to intensify. It was like a whisper, but not of human voices. It was a low sound, as if the floor itself were trying to tell me a secret. I turned in bed, trying to ignore it, but the feeling that something was happening beyond the wall was undeniable. I was in a place that made no sense, and I knew I could no longer escape this realization. It was no longer a simple feeling of exhaustion or paranoia. Something was unfolding there, and I was the only one to witness it. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, tired from the road, the long days, the exhausting tour. But as the sound repeated, something inside me knew it wasn't my imagination. The feeling of being watched intensified, not just because the noise was coming from below, but because it seemed to come from the very space around me, as if the walls, the ceiling, the floor, everything were shrouded in mystery, as if this place lived in a way I couldn't comprehend. I got out of bed, still dizzy, my body slowed by fear and uncertainty. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The neon lights continued to flicker in the darkness outside, but there was no movement, not a single person, not a shadow. Still, that feeling of unease wouldn't go away. I returned to the center of the room, where the dim light from the lamp only partially illuminated the aged furniture. It was when I looked back at the floor that the sound grew louder, a distant scraping, almost as if something were trying to move out from under the floor. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. With each passing second, the feeling that something was there, something or someone, intensified. It was as if the motel itself was feeding on my fear, as if it knew exactly how to lure me into its traps. I wasn't alone anymore, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise. Something was moving beneath the floorboards, and it wasn't just old wood. It was something more, something deeper. I decided to investigate. I tried to push aside the dread that was gnawing at me, and with a surge of courage, began pulling up the carpet, ignoring the trembling in my hands. I knew whatever lay beneath that flooring was no simple matter, but I pressed on anyway. Each movement seemed heavy, each step more difficult than the last. The sound grew louder as I pulled at the fabric, and a growing sense of urgency washed over me, as if I were being forced to uncover something I wasn't ready to understand. And then, what I found was worse than I could have imagined. What should have been a simple wooden floor turned out to be a secret door, a dark passage that seemed endless. I hesitated, my body trembling at the thought of what might be waiting down there. But what frightened me most wasn't what I saw, but the feeling that somehow I already knew what lay behind that door, something that had been waiting for me for a long time. I was in the right place. The motel somehow was calling me down. The staircase that led down into the depths was dark and cold. The wood creaked beneath my feet as if warning of what was to come. Fear was replaced by an almost desperate curiosity, as if something deep inside me knew I had to keep going, that I couldn't turn back. The darkness was dense, as if something were filling it, and as I descended, the feeling that I was being pulled toward something larger and more dangerous only grew. The next morning, still not fully understanding what was happening, I decided to go out and try to find out more. The feeling of unease wouldn't leave me alone, and I knew I needed answers. That place, with all its decay and the discomfort it emanated, was more than just old. It was charged with something, a hidden energy that made me feel I wasn't alone. Curiosity overcame me, and I went to the reception, still hoping that maybe I was overreacting, that my mind was just too tired from the road and sleepless nights. When I got there, the staff were talking in hushed tones, almost as if exchanging information that wasn't meant for anyone else to hear. I stood back, trying to catch what they were saying without them realizing I was listening. I knew something was wrong with the place, and now my instincts were telling me I needed to dig deeper. They were talking about the land the motel had been built on, and it was when an old name popped up in the conversation that made me stop. Old residents of the area talk about the cemetery. That stopped me in my tracks. I knew I'd heard something about it the night before, but I didn't want to believe that this place was somehow connected to a dark past. The staff weren't just swapping random stories. They were discussing the fact that the motel, at some point in history, had been built on sacred ground. It wasn't just the place's decaying appearance that made me uneasy, but the feeling that I was in a place carrying a much heavier history, a buried mystery that no one wanted to reveal. The most disturbing thing was hearing that the place wasn't just an ordinary motel. No, the land where it stood was already the site of something much older, much more sinister. The motel had been built on the remains of an ancient cemetery, and what I didn't know the night I arrived was that the energy emanating from the place wasn't just a sense of decay. It was the legacy of decades, perhaps centuries, of lost souls whose bodies had never been completely removed. What lay beneath my room was, in fact, a prison of shadows that refused to be forgotten. These fragments of conversation began to fit together like pieces of a dark puzzle. The motel wasn't just a transit point, but a forced resting place for those somehow connected to this dark past. I began to understand then that the feeling of being watched, the sound coming from beneath the floor, and even the heavy air in the room were more than just symptoms of an old building. It was as if the motel itself was trying to tell me something, as if it were drawing me to understand the hidden truth it had held for so long. But most disturbing of all was the last thing I heard. One of the staff members, with a weary, somber expression, mentioned something about the silent testimonies that had been left by those who had stayed there over the years. People didn't know it, but many of the previous guests had felt the same as I had. The presence, the weight of history, as if the space itself were alive, breathing, and waiting for the right moment to reveal what had been hidden there for so long. Now, with this information, I knew that what I had discovered was not the end of my journey, but the beginning of something much deeper. This was no ordinary motel, but a portal to something beyond what our eyes could see. And to understand what was truly happening there, I would have to go even deeper, not just into the motel, but within myself, facing whatever lay waiting in the depths of that place. And no matter how much I tried to rationalize, something told me the mystery wasn't there just to be solved. It was as if the motel had a mission, a reason for being, and my presence there was no coincidence. I had been drawn to it, as if something had guided me to this point, something older, deeper, something that, once uncovered, could no longer be ignored. And with each passing moment, the more I felt the truth about the motel was just beginning to reveal itself. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because what I was about to discover wasn't just about the motel, but about the very nature of the mysteries that lie beyond what we see. I was beginning to realize that this motel was just the beginning of something much larger, something involving decisions and destinies beyond my comprehension. What was to come would be a revelation so profound that, once uncovered, nothing could ever return to normal. If you've ever felt drawn to a place, or if you've ever felt that something was hidden beneath the surface, comment below. That makes sense to me. And share what you think about this energy that seems to surround certain places and the secrets they hold. I was already beginning to feel completely immersed in it all, as if I'd somehow been drawn to that motel by something I didn't yet understand. The more I tried to push away the questions, the more impossible they became to ignore. The feeling that this place hid something profound, something I shouldn't discover, grew with each passing minute. The silence, which had previously seemed like a simple characteristic of the environment, now seemed more like a trap, a preparation to make me more vulnerable to what was to come. So, without further ado, I knew I needed to go further, to investigate deeper. What I'd found on the lower floor was just the beginning, but I still didn't have all the answers. What else was hidden there? What else was being protected by those rusty walls and the place's abandonment? Something told me there was more behind the motel's old worn facade, something much older, something that could explain the strange energy I sensed there. I returned to my room, my heart still racing, trying to organize my thoughts, but unable to shake the weight the place seemed to carry. I went to the closet and, as I rummaged through the clothes that were thrown at the back, something caught my eye. Among the old wrinkled clothes, I found a map. The paper was faded, stained with age, but clearly old. I went to the desk and, with trembling hands, unfolded the map. My heart raced when I realized it wasn't a simple tourist map or a blueprint of the motel. No, it was something much deeper. The map showed the area where the motel was built, but the strangest thing was that it indicated a plot of land that somehow seemed much older than the motel itself. The area wasn't just a commercial building. It had been a cemetery long before the motel was built. Something the map didn't reveal, but which was evident from the layout of the land, was that this land had been the site of rituals, of something sinister that was now buried in the foundations of the place. It wasn't just an old, abandoned lot. It was a land that held secrets, a site of occult practices and dead people who were never truly left behind. I was beginning to realize that the motel wasn't just an old building, but a layer of history that extended far beyond what I'd imagined. The motel's construction had been merely the final layer of something much more macabre, something that was somehow being kept hidden by the walls of those simple rooms. The silence, the feeling of being watched, the noise coming from below, it was all beginning to make sense. The motel wasn't just a facade. It was there to hide a story no one wanted to tell, something that still lived underground and that perhaps wouldn't be so easily erased. That discovery left me even more disturbed, because, in understanding it, something inside me knew that the motel had a much deeper connection to the past than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just a simple plot of land. It was a place of power, a place where rituals of worship and sacrifice had been performed, where lives and deaths intertwined. I knew that map was the key to understanding what was happening there, but I also knew that the deeper I delved, the more dangerous the path became. I didn't know what to make of the information. That map, which had seemed harmless at first, now left me with more questions than answers. How had no one known about this? How had the motel continued to operate there, ignoring this part of the past? Or indeed, did they know? What else was hidden in the foundations of that place? That map seemed to be the gateway to a much greater mystery, one that was unfolding before me, layer by layer. something that challenged me to continue, even when I knew it might be too late to turn back. Because what I'm beginning to understand about that motel and the land it was built on is leaving me speechless. There's more behind the walls, you see, more than the simple space you occupy. And this journey to discover what's really happening there has made me think of all the other stories that, like this one, are buried beneath the surface. The impact of what happens in these places, the impact of decisions made long ago, directly affects those who pass through them. That crack in the floor wasn't just a flaw in the wood. It was like a door, an opening that called to me, drew me in with an invisible, unstoppable force. I knew that when I pulled up the carpet and discovered what lay beneath, it wouldn't be the same. Something about the atmosphere in the room was already uncomfortable, and now, with the sight of that crack, everything seemed to become even more real. An inexplicable feeling of dread washed over me, but at the same time, an even stronger curiosity drove me on. The carpet came away easily, more easily than I expected. Each pull revealed a little more of what lay hidden beneath. And then, what I saw paralyzed me. A staircase, simple and old, descended into the depths. The hole in the floor felt like an abyss, and I couldn't look at it without feeling a pressure in my chest. The darkness coming from below seemed to swallow any hope of sanity I might have had. But at the same time, something inside me told me I couldn't ignore it. I didn't know what else I might find there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was destined to discover what was buried there. It was as if the motel itself was daring me to go down, to explore what had been hidden there for so long. The feeling of dread was instantaneous. I felt as if an invisible presence was watching me, waiting for me to make the decision to go downstairs. But the fear I felt wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was something more primal, something telling me not to go down, not to dare go any deeper into that place. There was a part of me, the rational part, that wanted to turn around, run away, and never look back. But what kept me from doing so was the feeling that I had already crossed a line, that there was no turning back. The staircase seemed inviting, but at the same time, it felt like a trap, a lure designed to lure curious people like me, who felt as if they were heading toward a revelation that could change everything. The air was cooler down there, and the smell was different, stronger, denser. I felt a shift in the pressure of the room, as if the space itself were swallowing me. Each step I took seemed heavier than the last, as if the motel itself were trying to prevent me from descending, or perhaps trying to draw me deeper into its mystery. The shadows below seemed to shift, as if something were waiting patiently, as if time had stopped somewhere, waiting for me to make the final decision. I hesitated, and for a long time, curiosity wanted to push me forward into the darkness, but fear held me back. I knew my life could change there, that the decision to go down those stairs could lead me to a place from which I could never return. But at the same time, I knew I was there for a reason. The truth about that motel and what lay buried in its foundations needed to be revealed. I felt it deep within me. It was at that moment that the voice inside me, the voice that warned me of the dangers, was silenced by something even stronger. A willpower that didn't want to leave the story incomplete. Something inside me knew I needed to dig deeper. That this wasn't just morbid curiosity, but a need to discover the truth. A truth that was somehow linked to my fate there. In that motel, that night, I began to realize that the motel wasn't just an abandoned place. It was a center of mysteries that were being kept secret, something so ancient that it couldn't be erased with the passing of time. I was already inside. There was no turning back, and with each step I took, I felt myself drawn further toward a revelation that would change my outlook on everything. What lay behind those stairs, what was waiting down there, was an answer I didn't want, but was about to find. Something I knew would change my life forever. The darkness below seemed to swallow me every step, and as much as I tried to remain calm, something inside me knew I was about to discover something that couldn't be ignored. I descended the stairs with a mixture of fear and curiosity, a growing tension in my body, as if the earth itself were calling me down into the abyss. The sound of the wood creaking beneath my feet was the only thing that broke the silence. Each step seemed deeper, further from the reality I knew, until finally, I reached the bottom. It was then that my eyes were opened to something that made me question everything I knew about the place. I never could have imagined that what lay beneath that motel was not just an ordinary basement, but something much deeper, much more sinister. The darkness around me dissolved, revealing what I feared, but at the same time, what I knew I had to see. What I found there was indescribable, a vision that seemed more like a nightmare than anything else. A cemetery, ancient, forgotten. The place was buried, literally, beneath the motel. Not just a few graves, but a vast cemetery, whose tombs were plunged into darkness, their headstones toppled over, their names erased by time. I didn't know what to think. How could this be possible? How had no one warned me about what was happening there? How had the place where I was now, where I thought was just another stop on the road, been built on land that held bodies, souls, and secrets so ancient? What terrified me most was realizing that it wasn't just bodies that had been buried there. The motel had been built on a sacred site, a plot of land that held more than mere mortal remains. It was a place of ritual, a place where death and the supernatural were intertwined, where the dead had not been fully exhumed and left behind. The bodies were there, still immersed in the depths of that place, and with them, their stories, their energies, their curses. This wasn't just a cemetery, it was a sacred space, possessed by something no one could fully comprehend. The names of the people who had been there, those who had been buried and forgotten over the years, were erased. There were no more records, no memory of those who had once rested there. That place, though seemingly silent, was alive with the presence of souls who had not found rest. And the strangest thing, I knew they were still there, waiting, watching, as if awaiting something. But what? And why was that motel built right on top of all that? It was difficult to process the gravity of the situation. The sense of dread I felt was indescribable. It wasn't just the fear of being in an isolated place, but the fear of having discovered something that should have remained hidden. The truth I now knew about that place changed everything. Not only about the motel, but about the very space I was in, about the impact of the actions of people who, in the past, had made decisions beyond all comprehension. The buried bodies weren't just reminders of a lost era, they were present there somehow. It was as if the motel itself had been built on a cycle of unresolved deaths, and now the souls of those who rested there were trapped, still awaiting an eternal rest that never came. I couldn't understand how the motel continued to operate. How had no one noticed what lay beneath that floor? How was the place kept running, knowing what was buried in its foundations? What I felt was not just a discovery, but a revelation, something that had been guarded and hidden from all those who, like me, passed by without any idea of what was hidden beneath their feet. The motel's walls, old and dilapidated as they were, seemed to carry a dark power, an untold story that should not be unearthed. The motel, with its cheap rooms and rundown appearance, was in fact a prison, a place of passage between the world of the living and the dead. Now, as my feet remained firmly planted in that submerged cemetery, I realized that the questions I'd been asking were beginning to be answered. The motel wasn't a mere construction accident, nor a simple planning flaw. It was there for a reason, and I, for some unknown reason, was now embroiled in its dark history. There was no way I could leave without understanding what was really going on there. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what lies buried in this place is not just the history of a motel. It's a journey that encompasses something greater than any of us could imagine. The impact these events had on past generations continues to affect the present, and with each step I took, the more I understood that the revelation that was about to come wasn't just about the motel. It was about the transformation of a place that had somehow been marked by destiny. Each discovery pulled me deeper into this mystery, pulling me away from a reality I already knew. Comment below. This makes sense to me if you've ever felt that some things aren't just coincidences, but rather destiny calling us to uncover hidden truths. What follows will show you more about the impact of these revelations and how much the past can still influence what we see today. As I descended those stairs, my senses were on high alert. The air felt heavier, the atmosphere denser, as if the motel itself were swallowing me. Each step felt like I was crossing an invisible line between the normal world and something I wasn't ready to understand. When I reached the bottom, the vision that unfolded before me was like a scene I'd only seen in horror movies, but it was there, right in front of me, real and tangible. The space was cold, with a dense, almost suffocating atmosphere. What I found wasn't just a dark room or any basement, but an ancient temple hidden deep within the motel. A stone altar covered in dust, but still exuded an unsettling energy, as if recently used. Around the altar, ancient symbols were engraved on the stones, symbols that, though I couldn't decipher, conveyed a clear sense that this was no ordinary structure. I was in a place that shouldn't exist, a place of worship, where ancient rituals were performed. Here, I knew, was not just a building with forgotten histories, but a space that served something much larger, much darker. There was something deeply wrong about that place. The energy I sensed seemed almost alive, as if the temple itself were waiting for something, as if it were nurturing something. I began to wonder what was happening there, who or what had benefited from so many years of worship and sacrifice. With each step I took toward the altar, the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just a vague sense of dread, it was a palpable presence, something I could feel in every bone in my body. Something was there, waiting, something I didn't want to encounter, but knew I had somehow already drawn it closer. The symbols engraved on the stones seemed to glow faintly as I approached. It wasn't light, but something more subtle, as if they were pulsing with an energy that called to me, as if connected to an ancient power, something that could be awakened at any moment. I knew I was facing something that could not be explained, something beyond my understanding. But worst of all, I was no longer in control. The energy of that place, the weight of its history, was overwhelming me, and I could no longer turn my back on it. I had to understand what was happening there, what else was being hidden, and why that motel was being used as a portal to something so far removed from the reality I knew. The altar itself seemed to have been used for some kind of ritual, and the surrounding stones were stained with something dark, a substance that seemed ancient yet fresh, as if the rituals continued to be performed even as time passed. The feeling that I wasn't the first to descend there hit me hard, as if others, like me, had been lured to this place and fallen into the same trap. Who or what was behind all this? I felt a pressure in the air, as if the temple was waiting for something or someone. It wasn't just an old motel. It wasn't just a transit point for weary tourists or lonely travelers. I was at the center of something much larger, something the motel itself was trying to hide, as if it were part of a much older plan. But what was really going on there? Who was performing the rituals? And what was the purpose of it all? Each new question seemed to pull me deeper, and I no longer knew if I could leave without discovering the truth, no matter how frightening. I felt like I was being tested, as if I were part of an experiment, a game that had been played for decades, if not centuries. I knew what was happening. There was no longer a simple mystery. It was a hidden truth being revealed before me, a truth that, terrifying as it was, I needed to understand. The motel, with its decaying facade, was not just a facade. It was a prison, a portal, a place of worship, where something else was being nurtured over the years. Each sacrifice, each ritual, fed what waited below, and I knew it wouldn't be easy to escape everything that was about to unfold. The feeling of being watched intensified inexplicably. I was there, in those depths, in the middle of that forgotten temple, and it was at that moment that I heard the footsteps. They weren't mine. They were heavy, dragging steps, as if someone or something was moving right behind me. The sound didn't come from far away, but close by, as if it were there, following me, observing my movements. My body froze for a moment, and fear, that primal fear, took hold of me so intensely that breathing became difficult. I knew something was there, something that shouldn't be there. I was no longer alone. Something was watching me, not human, and older than I could fathom. The sensation was like a cold blade piercing my spine, paralyzing my body and forcing me to look around. But there was no one, only silence, only darkness. But I could feel a presence, an unwelcome presence, a presence that had been there long before me and that didn't want me there now. This fear was unlike any other. It was deep, rooted, as if the place, the motel itself and its foundations, were alive. Something so evil, so rooted in the shadows of that place that it no longer cared. Who was above, walking on the surface? What disturbed me most was what I saw next. When I turned, a shadow appeared on the wall, distorting and stretching erratically, as if it didn't belong in reality. I couldn't see the outline of a figure, but something inside me knew what was happening. I couldn't make out a shape, but what frightened me most was that the shadow didn't seem to follow the rules of physics or light. It was a manifestation, something that shouldn't exist, but it was there, somehow taking shape, feeding on my fear, on my energy. It was as if it had been waiting for me, watching me since the moment I entered that place. I didn't know what else to do. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out of there, to run away. But my feet felt heavy, as if the gravity of the place were holding me down. Something told me I shouldn't look at the shadow anymore, but at the same time, I couldn't look away. Fear and curiosity were mingling in such a strange, intoxicating way that I no longer knew where one sensation began and the other ended. The fear of knowing what lay behind that shadow was immense, but at the same time, the desire to understand what was happening there, to understand what that entity wanted from me, was even stronger. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps intensified. It was no longer a soft, distant sound, but a presence approaching, advancing toward me. I looked back once more, but there was no one. No one was there. I could no longer control the panic that was spreading within me. I knew I had to get out, that I couldn't stay there a second longer. Something was approaching, something that wouldn't allow me to leave easily, and in a desperate impulse, I ran. I ran down the stairs, through the shadows, through the walls that now seemed to close in around me. The air was thick, as if I were being swallowed by that place, as if it were preventing me from leaving, as if the foundations of those walls were trapping me there forever. I reached my room panting, without looking back, without stopping to think. I locked the door tightly and turned away from the window, staring at the street outside. There, the road seemed calm, silent, as if nothing had happened, as if the night were just another of the many trips I'd taken over the years. But it wasn't. I knew what was happening. I knew that this motel, this place where I thought it would be just a respite, wasn't what it seemed. I wasn't alone, and what was watching me down, there wasn't there by chance. It was as if it had been waiting for me, luring me into its story, and now that I knew what was happening, there was no escape. What I'd just discovered, the truth about the motel, about what was happening there, wasn't just a ghost story or something supernatural. It wasn't just a passing fear or a rundown place. What I experienced that night, what I felt, led me to a transformation I hadn't expected. I was facing something bigger, something more impactful than anything I'd ever experienced before. The motel, what it held, wasn't a coincidence. None of it was an accident. I was there for a reason, and now I needed to fully understand what was happening, how it all connected, how past and present somehow intertwined in that dirty, old room. I felt panic wash over me, a cold wave spreading through every nerve in my body. The motel doors, the stairs leading down into the unknown, the footsteps echoing in my mind, all of it faded into a blur of fear and instinct. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just reacted. I ran from the room, never looking back. Every step I took seemed to take me a little further away from the reality I knew, and closer to something I knew I couldn't fully understand. I couldn't be there anymore, no matter what, no matter the cost. I had to get out. The exit door seemed further away than ever, and I was being pulled into the darkness of something I couldn't control. Fear, visceral and urgent, gripped me, pushing me out of the place, into the light of day, into the world outside where, at least, I still felt like I could breathe. But even as I ran, a part of me knew I wasn't completely free. That feeling that the motel somehow still had me, that what I'd discovered wouldn't be left behind so easily. I knew my escape wouldn't be complete. Something inside me knew that the truth about this place, about what it held, would still haunt me. The street air felt fresh, as if offering me momentary relief, but there was still a sense of something watching me, something following me. The road ahead felt safe, but in the back of my mind, I knew something was behind me, not physically, but in the essence of everything that had happened that night. Every step I took on the street, every patch of ground I left behind, seemed to pull me back to that place, to that feeling. I didn't know what would happen if I went back. Something in my gut told me that if I went back to the motel, if I tried to go back to that staircase, to that door, I would never leave. The fear of no longer being able to escape, of being lost forever in the depths of that place, was real and palpable. I had to keep going. I knew I couldn't go back, that if I did, if my curiosity took me back, it could be the end of my freedom, the end of my peace, and perhaps the end of everything I knew is real. I ran through the streets without thinking, without another word in my head, just the sound of my feet hitting the asphalt, pushing me away from everything. I just wanted to get to a safe place, a place where the world was normal again. But as I walked further and further away from the motel, I felt the sensation of being watched didn't diminish. It intensified, as if an invisible force was calling me back, as if the place wanted me to return and finish what I started. But I couldn't. I couldn't anymore. Now, more than ever, I needed to understand what was happening there. I knew I couldn't live with this doubt, with this feeling that whatever was buried in that motel, whatever had been hidden for so long, had somehow chosen me. But at the same time, I knew my mind needed a break, that I needed time to process everything that had happened. I couldn't just leave and move on as if nothing had happened. Not now. The motel was more than just an old building, more than a waypoint on the road. It held a power, an energy, a history that would not be easily forgotten. And as I walked away, I felt the impact of that. Journey was just beginning. What I'd discovered about the motel, what was hidden there, could not be erased. There was something profound, something that touched the core of everyone's reality who passed through there, and I would never be the same. I would no longer be able to see the world the same way. Everything had changed. The fear I felt as I fled was not just physical, but existential, as if I were leaving a place where the normal rules of time and space no longer apply. I was in a territory beyond human comprehension. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because what I'm beginning to understand isn't just about the motel, but about something deeper that's intertwined with the very nature of the mysteries that exist in places like that. The true force behind the motel, what was waiting for me there, the impact of past decisions and how they affected my journey. All of this needs to be explored. I knew there was something more, and that my journey was just beginning. With each answer, more questions arose. What else was involved? What was the true background to what I had witnessed? Comment below. This makes sense to me. If you've ever felt the presence of something invisible, something that made you question everything around you, or if you've also had an experience that left you with the feeling that you were being guided by something greater. Now, looking back, I realize how much I underestimated that place. At first, the motel seemed like just another roadside stop, something simple, just a stopover between trips. The idea of a quiet night to rest and continue on my journey seemed so natural. I didn't even think twice before checking in. I just wanted a place to sleep, a temporary refuge from the fatigue of the road. I never imagined that within hours my perception of the world would be turned upside down. What seemed like an ordinary, dull, and even a bit run-down place turned into the biggest nightmare of my life. And all because I ignored something we all at some point choose to ignore, our instincts. I didn't want to believe the feeling of unease, those small clues that something was wrong, the smell in the air, the eerie silence, the whispers I heard. Deep down, my instincts told me something was hidden, something I shouldn't touch. But what did I do? I kept going, ignoring the messages the place itself was giving me. I was so focused on finding a place to rest that I didn't realize that somehow the motel was already controlling me, leading me deeper into its dark mystery. And now, looking back, I realized that if I had simply listened to what my body and mind were telling me, perhaps it wouldn't have been so easy to fall into the trap the place had set. That motel wasn't just a place to rest. It was a prison disguised as a shelter, a trap that lured the curious and the weary into its web, making them lose themselves without even realizing it. I was one of those victims, and most importantly, I learned that some things shouldn't be unearthed. Some stories shouldn't be uncovered. Certain places have an energy of their own, a story hidden between the lines, far beyond what meets the eye. Sometimes the best thing to do is simply leave, to leave before curiosity leads us to discover something we can no longer control. If you learn anything from this story, let it be this. Never ignore your instincts. Never ignore the signals that the place, the situation, or even life itself is giving you. Our bodies and minds are constantly processing information that we may not immediately understand, but which deep down know when something is not right. Sometimes fear isn't just fear. It's a protection that comes from within, trying to warn us to be careful, to not advance any further. I didn't listen to my fear, and because of that, I was dragged into that place, into a mystery that, in the end, only brought me more questions than answers. The motel wasn't just a roadside stop. It was a transition point, a threshold between what we know and what lies beyond our comprehension. And no matter how hard I tried to escape those shadows, those sensations, I knew I could never again ignore what I experienced there. The impact of it all seared itself into my mind, my body, like a constant reminder that there are things we shouldn't try to understand. When the unknown reveals itself, there's no going back. Now it's time to reflect, to look at my own journey and understand what it all truly meant. Life isn't just made up of calm, predictable moments. It's made up of choices, decisions, and paths we take without knowing exactly where they'll lead. And sometimes, these choices put us in places that, as much as we want to understand, we simply need to accept and move on. Perhaps the motel was just a metaphor for something bigger that needed to be understood, that curiosity can lead us to dark places, but it can also teach us valuable lessons about our own limits and the mysteries that exist in the world around us. Now, looking back, I see that what I experienced in that motel wasn't just an isolated experience, but a turning point, a true journey that shook my mind and my perception of everything around me. Sometimes we find ourselves confronted by mysteries, by places that seem ordinary but hold much deeper secrets. These places challenge us, drawing us into a reality we're often unprepared to face. But when the journey calls us, we can't simply ignore it. I know many of you may have experienced something similar, or perhaps even felt the presence of something inexplicable at some point in your life. Sometimes life puts us in situations where the truth is buried beneath the surface, and it's only when we have the courage to delve deeper, to look beyond the obvious, that we can see what's really happening. I've shared my experience here, and now I want to hear from you. If you've had a similar experience, something that made you question the reality around you, or if you believe something like this could happen, I'd love to hear your story. In the comments, share your thoughts on this. I want to know what you think about this feeling that the unknown is just lurking, waiting to be discovered. What would you do if you were in my shoes? What would you do if you had the chance to explore the secrets of a place so steeped in mystery? Would you have the courage to descend, as I did, or would you rather run away before it was too late? If this story resonated with you, or if it somehow touched a chord within you, tell me. This resonates with me, because sometimes we're all connected by these experiences that shape us, transform us, and challenge us to understand something greater than ourselves. I know there are many more mysteries like this out there, and I look forward to sharing more with you so we can continue exploring, together, all that the unknown has to offer.